lots of stuff. So this one here, I've been invited along to talk a wee bit about eligibility and entitlement for enrolment. So without further ado, I will share my screen and hopefully do it right. All right, have you just got the single big screen up there?
Yes, we do, Justin. Yeah.
Great, awesome. Okay, so eligibility and entitlement. Why does it matter? I guess at the end of the day, we're a relatively small country with limited resources, so we need to be careful where those resources go. And this includes ensuring that the health dollar is spent on those who need it and are entitled to it. So being eligible gives a person a right to be considered for publicly funded health and disability services. And if eligible, these services could be subsidised or even free. But eligibility is just one part of the equation. The enrolment requirements also expect practices to assess the person's entitlement to enrol. And if they're deemed to be eligible and entitled, then the formal enrolment process can be followed. So eligibility, there are 10 different criteria where a person might find themselves eligible. And these are described in the Health and Disability Services Eligibility Direction 2011. And we'll talk about those 10 different criteria soon. As well as being eligible, they do need to be entitled, and there are 3 aspects to entitlement. The main one, of course, is the person must be residing permanently in New Zealand. That means they must be in New Zealand at least 183 days of the year. That's 6 months and 1 day. The second part to entitlement is they must want to use you or your practice as their ongoing regular health provider. And what I mean by that, just as an example, I'm from Christchurch. If I went up and worked in Auckland for a week and fell ill and visited a general practice up there, although I'm eligible to enrol, I'm not entitled because I have no intention of continuing to use that doctor. So that doctor should actually turn my enrolment application down. So that's number 2. Number 3 is the person mustn't be receiving their health care through a different funding agreement. And I'm really talking about people in the Defence Force and people in prison. For Defence Force personnel, the Defence Force is responsible for their health care, and for people in prison, the Department of Corrections is responsible for their health care. So they shouldn't be enrolled while in the Defence Force or in prison. So once you've deemed a person as eligible and entitled, they become fully eligible and you can run through the enrolment process with them. So let's look at the 10 different eligibility criteria. So as well as being entitled, a person should be a New Zealand citizen or someone from the Cook Islands, Niue or Tokelau. They're considered New Zealand citizens. Or if a person holds a resident visa or a permanent resident visa, they will be eligible. Any person who is an Australian citizen or an Australian permanent resident and has been or intends to be in New Zealand for at least 2 years, they will be eligible. As far as enrolment goes, I wouldn't be too concerned about these people. And when I say don't be too concerned, as long as they can provide evidence that they are an Australian resident or citizen and tell you they're going to be in New Zealand for at least 2 years, that's enough for enrolment. We have, in all the 15 years I've been auditing practices for eligibility, we have never ever challenged a practice for having enrolled an Australian citizen. So that one's relatively safe. The biggest problem with Australian citizens is if they do need to go to hospital, they have a slightly higher level of evidence required that they are intending to stay in New Zealand for 2 years or more. So they may request the person, you know, if they do need to go to hospital, they may look at rental agreements or job contracts, something like that, just to prove the 2 years staying in New Zealand. Fourth criteria, if someone has a current work visa and is able to show that he or she has been in New Zealand or intends to be in New Zealand for at least 2 years. So previous permits or visas are permitted here, as long as the current visa is a work visa. That work visa together with previous visas, as long as they're 2 years or more, that person will be eligible. Anyone who holds an interim visa who was eligible immediately prior to receiving the interim visa, they will be eligible. Any refugee or protected person, or a refugee or person who's going through the process, they will be eligible, and that includes victims or suspected victims of people trafficking. They will be able to provide you documentation to show that you know, they are one of the, they do fit into one of these criteria. Any person who's under the age of 18 years, who's in the care and control of a parent or legal guardian who meets one of the eligibility criteria, the under 18-year-old will also be eligible. So in those instances, all you really need to do is keep on file evidence of the parent or legal guardian being eligible. Any person who's on a New Zealand aid program or an official development assistantship funding, receiving that, they will be eligible. That's more for, you'll probably find not too many in the Northland area. That's normally people around the universities will fit into that category. So they'll hold a student visa, plus they will be a scholarship holder. And that's the same for people participating in the Ministry of Education Foreign Language Teaching Assistantship Scheme, and those people on a Commonwealth scholarship. So they will also be eligible. But like I say, you probably won't come across too many of those. They normally are around the university areas. So there's the 10 different eligibility criteria. Some are definitely more common than others. But if we look at entitlement, I mentioned that people from Niue, Tokelau and Cook Islands are eligible. They have the same eligibility citizenship status as a New Zealand citizen. But how does that relate to entitlement? In particular, the residing in New Zealand for at least 6 months a year. Unfortunately, any time they spent on the Cook Islands or in Niue or Tokelau is not considered time spent in New Zealand. So whilst they might be eligible, if they are living on those particular islands, they're not actually entitled to enrol, so you can't enrol them. New Zealand is of course the North Island, South Island and Stewart Island, but it also includes 7 other islands, being Auckland Islands, Campbell Islands, the Antipodes, Bounty Islands, 3 King Islands, the Kermadec and Chatham Islands. You probably only have to really worry about the Chatham Islands and the Kermadec, as the other islands don't have anyone living on them. And I think most of the Chatham Islanders tend to use Wellington practices as well. So the testing of eligibility is unfortunately the practice's responsibility, but that so is the ongoing testing of eligibility. So most people, you will probably only need to test their eligibility once, and that's when they first enrol. But any person who's on a time-limited visa, such as a work visa, you will need to retest their eligibility when that work visa is about to expire. And there's different systems practices use. You know, some set up tasks, some set up diary notes or run spreadsheets to you know, look at these visas when they're about to expire. And I believe most practice management systems now have a field where you can actually put the expiry date, and you can run queries on that field as a wee reminder to follow these particular patients up. And unfortunately, you really do need to you know, check the different visas and the expiry dates, because as this slide demonstrates, there are often gaps or can be gaps between visas which interrupt the 2 years of consecutive visas. This is a real live example that we found during one of our eligibility data matches with immigration, where a particular person only became eligible once they had received their third work visa. At that point, they had 2 years or more consecutive, but then unfortunately didn't apply for the fourth work visa soon enough, and there ended up being another gap between the visas, so they lost their eligibility status again. So as you can see here, they were in the country 6 years and were only actually eligible for about 1 year of it because they didn't get their ducks in a row and apply for the work visas in the appropriate timeframes. One thing, it's a reasonably new service, or when I say new, it's been around maybe a couple of years, that Immigration New Zealand run. It's called the Visa Verification Service, and it allows education providers and health providers to access their system and check the latest visa status for a person. So you won't get a history of visas, but you will be able to see the person's latest visa. So if you have subscribed to this particular service through Immigration New Zealand, and if you have the patient's consent, then you can log into the system and check their latest visa status. So this could be something, getting patient's consent, this could be something you do at the time you enroll somebody. Either have another question on the enrolment form or a separate bit of paper just saying, giving you permission to check the visa verification service at any stage through their enrolment. A lot of practices find this quite useful. Interim visas. So not every person who comes into the practice with an interim visa will actually be eligible. So as mentioned, a person on an interim visa will only be eligible if they were eligible prior to receiving the interim visa. So an interim visa will only ever be issued to someone who is, number one, in New Zealand. They must currently hold a valid temporary visa. And when I say temporary visa, you're probably looking at the work visa there. So they must hold a current work visa, and they must have applied for a further visa and have that application accepted by Immigration New Zealand prior to their current visa expiring. If they meet those criteria, then they will receive an interim visa. If they do have an interim visa, it will be valid automatically for 6 months. And it will only expire upon 3 things happening. First one is, as soon as the next visa is approved and granted, the interim will expire. If the visa application is declined, then the interim visa will expire 21 days after that. Or if the person departs New Zealand whilst on an interim visa, the interim visa will also automatically expire at that stage as well. So like I mentioned, not all interim visa holders are eligible. Here we had an example. So these are real life examples we found through data matches. This person here had a 1-year work visa before getting the interim. Because a 1-year work visa doesn't allow someone to be eligible, when they got their interim, they also weren't eligible on that because they weren't eligible prior to receiving the interim. So as far as what proof of eligibility and identity you can look for, and this here is what we consider best practice. So actually retaining evidence of eligibility it's not actually mandatory, but it is actually best practice to do that. And how can you assess whether someone is eligible unless you do actually cite evidence? So the best, certainly for New Zealand citizens, Cook Islanders, Niueans and Tokelauans, the best evidence you could possibly get is a passport. Passport or a birth certificate with 2 forms of proof that they are the person on the birth certificate. So they're the best forms. You could ask for a New Zealand certificate of citizenship and 2 forms of supporting identification documentation, or a descent registration certificate and 2 forms of identity documentation. One thing that might help for people who don't meet the first criteria there is any person who is receiving a social security benefit. That's any benefit. I don't know the names of all of them, you know, the old DPB or sole person benefit, an unemployment benefit, sickness benefit, any benefit other than the emergency benefit, that person will be eligible. So Working Income New Zealand or Social Development, they've already tested their eligibility. So you can rely on a person having a benefit as them being eligible. One thing here is that has come up during some of these discussions or some of these presentations is there will be some people who will never ever be able to provide any sort of documentation at all. So you will have people who might be living on the street, you know, something like that, and they simply have nothing they can show you. Now, some of those people are obviously in more need than others, and we certainly don't want to turn those people away from health services they may need. So in situations where you believe someone genuinely cannot show you anything, maybe ask a few questions, you know, where they were born, you know, what school they went to. Ask a few questions that will hopefully give you an idea that they were, you know, born in New Zealand, that they are definitely a New Zealand citizen. And, you know, if you do have that gut feel, yep, I believe this person is, and I know they can't show me anything, just write a, you know, reasonably good audit note on in your daily record or attached to an enrolment form, just saying, you know, person lives on the street or whatever their circumstances are, have nothing they can provide us. We've asked these sorts of questions and our gut feel is they're definitely eligible. Let them fill out an enrolment form and let them enroll. Yeah, like I say, we certainly don't want to be turning away some of you know, the country's sort of most needy people. For foreign nationals, it's a different story. Foreign nationals will definitely or should definitely be able to provide you some proof of eligibility and identity. They wouldn't have got in the country without a passport for a start. So definitely insist on seeing something for foreign nationals. One of the biggest, I guess, problems you might have is that there are a group of UK citizens who came into the country in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, who at that time never actually needed a passport. And they never actually left New Zealand after they arrived. They are considered New Zealand residents. So anyone who came into the country prior to the 2nd of April 1974 and who has never left New Zealand, they are considered New Zealand residents. Any person or foreign national who came in after 1974, if they can't provide something, they will need to approach Immigration New Zealand and, you know, get something in writing from them, just showing what resident status they actually have. And Immigration New Zealand will be able to provide that. Other forms of identity documents include driver's license, plus 18 card. As far as identity goes, employment contracts, rental agreements, letters addressed to the patient at their current address, they all help to build a picture of someone's identity. We've also had questions about, can you rely on the community services card as evidence of eligibility? The 100% answer is no. Oh, sorry, when I say 100% answer, a community services card will be 99.5% evidence of eligibility. But the trouble is, there are very rare occasions where a non-eligible person can also hold a community services card. So in lieu of anything else, if a person does have a community services card, the risk of enrolling them will be very, very, very low. So it may be that as a practice, you may say, look, we're prepared to accept the risk of getting it wrong occasionally, and rely on a community services card as evidence of eligibility. Knowing that, of course, if you do get it wrong and the person is found to be ineligible upon an audit happening, there could be a financial ramification to the practice. But, you know, like I say, the practice may be prepared to take that risk, given the risk is very, very low. One of the criteria for eligibility is, of course, a work visa. Here's an older style work visa. The work visa prior to this was very, very similar, but there was always a problem, as it would have a start date and an expiry date, but you also needed to know when they came into the country, because if they came into the country after the start date, that would actually lessen the time frame of the visa. So the good news is most new work visas, in the conditions there, they will actually say the visa expires 24 months after first arrival. So now it doesn't matter when they arrive. We know that the visa is good for 24 months or 12 months or however long it states in the conditions. Most of the visas you'll probably see now will be by way of an e-visa or a letter, so they'll probably look more like this. One thing to be wary of, and we have struck it on a couple of occasions now, is being a letter like this. They are obviously easier to forge or alter, and we have struck this a couple of times. So whilst you can take what you are provided at face value, if for whatever reason, maybe the font is unusual, or something doesn't quite look right, and you are questioning, or have a question whether this e-visa is genuine or not, definitely check it out. At the end of this presentation, there will be a phone number or an email address. So if you do have any concerns about what you have received as evidence of eligibility, you can contact the Ministry of Health's Health Integrity line, and they can check it out for you. So as far as the eligibility criteria go, we talk about resident visas, we talk about work visas. It doesn't talk about student visas, because someone on a student visa is not eligible, unless, of course, they are a scholarship holder, a New Zealand Aid Program, Commonwealth Scholarship, something like that. If they are a scholarship holder, they will be able to provide you a letter from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, talking about the scholarship and giving the dates of the scholarship. So if someone comes on a student visa, the short answer is no, you're not eligible unless you are a scholarship holder. And if you are, we want to see your letter from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So that's the eligibility side of scholarship holders. But you do also need to be aware of the entitlement side, the residing in New Zealand for 6 months or more. So here's another example we found during one of our audits, where the person was a scholarship holder, but the scholarship was actually just for 3 months. They were just popping back into New Zealand to finish off a thesis, and they were only in the country for 3 months. So yes, they were eligible, but they weren't entitled because they weren't here for at least 6 months of the year. So just keep that at the back of your mind. Check entitlement as well. As part of our audits, we do find practices who sometimes get a little bit confused about some of the visas they see. If you look at the bottom of this particular visa here, in the conditions it says the holder may work as any occupation in New Zealand for any employer. Now, in this particular instance, the practice thought, because it mentioned they were allowed to work, they thought this was a work visa. It's not a work visa. The type of visa it is always stated at the top of the visa. And in this case, it was just a student visa with conditions. So always look at effectively the title of what the visa is, not just the conditions down the bottom. And here's a new one we've picked up, or seems to be prevalent in the last couple of years. We're coming across diplomatic, consular and official visas. So people have been enrolled in practices because they have had one of these visas. Those particular visas do not make someone eligible. So they do not fit one of the criteria in the eligibility direction. For diplomats and consular staff, the country they are from, they are responsible for their healthcare. And so anyone on these visas cannot enrol. One of the things that you can use as evidence of eligibility is, of course, a birth certificate. That was all very well up until 2006. Anyone born in New Zealand up until 2006 was deemed a New Zealand citizen. However, from 2006 onwards, just being born in New Zealand did not make someone eligible. So if someone was born in New Zealand to two overseas visitors, say, then that baby, even though born here, would not be a New Zealand citizen. So on any birth certificate from 2006 onwards, you'll see an extra question down here on the left, and it will say New Zealand citizen by birth. It'll ask that question, and you'll see a yes or a no. So any new 2006 onward birth certificates, do look at that question there, and that will tell you whether they will be eligible or not. Another way of testing eligibility on your system, and you'll have to excuse this old graphic here, that's the old medtech system. You may or may not have the old system, but there is a button on most PMS systems, practice management systems, that will link you to the NHI. So if you go to the NHI button, and that will take you to the patient demographics comparison screen. And down in the bottom right, there was another button, the view details. So you could see the NHI details for a person, and it will take you to the full NHI record. There is a section there for citizenship. And if you see in that record that someone is a citizen and their citizen status says DIA data share, that means they are eligible. DIA is, of course, the Department of Internal Affairs. So what has happened is the Ministry of Health has matched the 5 million people in New Zealand with the births, deaths and marriages register, and they've been able to update the NHI records for 1.7 million people as being an eligible New Zealand citizen by birth. So if you do see this in the citizenship tab of the NHI record that they're a citizen by a DIA data share, then that's all the evidence of eligibility you need. You do not need to seek any further evidence from the patient themselves. So here's just a little screenshot showing another finding from one of our immigration data matches. And this is data for one particular person over a decade. So it's 10 years worth of travel data. Now, of course, practices don't have the luxury of seeing something like this all in one go. But this just goes to show you that not only testing eligibility is important, but entitlement. I keep going back to entitlement, but it's just as important as eligibility. So here we had a particular person who you can see by the days in column, that's days in New Zealand, that this person on average over the last 10 years has only been in New Zealand about 3 weeks per year, and days out of the country are huge. So in this instance, this person was actually living in Samoa and would pop back into the country, firstly, at least 3 occasions just to give birth to little babies. But during that time, this person enrolled at least 3 times. So for her to enroll at least 3 times whilst living in Samoa, she was either lying to the practice about her entitlement and claiming she was living in New Zealand, or the practice wasn't testing entitlement, wasn't asking the question, are you living in New Zealand at least 6 months a year? So when someone enrolls with the practice, do ask that next question, are you living in New Zealand 6 months at least per year? So in summary, when someone walks in the door and wants to enrol, check they're eligible. If they are, great, check they're entitled. And if they are entitled and do want to use you as their ongoing provider of healthcare, run through the enrolment process with them. So I've talked a wee bit about this data matching that we do with Immigration New Zealand. So this happened after about 2 years of going through court, going through the Privacy Commissioner. We were finally able to come to a memorandum of understanding with Immigration New Zealand, which allowed us to match health data with Immigration New Zealand's data. And we've been running these random and targeted data matches with Immigration New Zealand since 2011. The process is quite lengthy. It takes about 6 months to go through. So it basically means or requires us to send the demographic information for a bunch of people to immigration. They match it with their system, send it back to the Ministry of Health. We then have to write to every single one of those people at their last known address and give them the opportunity to either confirm they're ineligible or refute it or argue the case. If they don't respond to our letter, or if they cannot satisfy us that they are eligible, we then write to the PHO with a list of people and practices, and we ask the PHO to make sure those people are removed from the register. So between 2011 and 2016, we have run 13 data matches, 8 of them random, 5 of them targeted. So those 5 targeted data matches included 26 different practices. And that's a total of about 2.6 million people we have data matched. Of those 2.6 million people, we found 40,000 of them were either not eligible or were living out of New Zealand. Of particular note, the random data matches, on average, we found about 1.4% of the people on those data matches were not eligible, and the targeted ones, it was about 3.6% of those particular people on the registers were not eligible. 13 of those practices were involved in a particularly special targeted data match, and of those 13 practices, the best of them, 4% of their register were ineligible, and at the least best of them, 11% of their entire patient population was not eligible. In 2018, we ran another very large data match, 2.2 million people, and we found almost 30,000 people were not eligible or living out of the country. So that effectively equates to, if those people were allowed to remain on the register and weren't removed, that equates to incorrect funding of over $350,000 per month. So it ends up meaning millions of dollars over the period of time that these people are enrolled, and that's money better spent elsewhere in the health system, operations and the like. So when we do one of these immigration data match audits, there are generally financial ramifications. So we run the data match, we notify the PHOs to notify the practices to remove these ineligible people. And as long as those practices do remove the ineligible people, then there are no ramifications at all. But what happens is maybe a year later or 2 years later, we will re-look at the patient register and we will see if those ineligible people have been removed. If we find they haven't been removed, then we will look at those particular practices. We will audit them and ask the practice to show us why these people are still on the patient register. And there may be very genuine reasons why they're on the register. Maybe since the data match, these people do now have a resident visa or do now have appropriate work visas, and that's fine. But if the practice can't satisfy us that these people should be on the register, there are financial ramifications. So we get the patient finally removed from the patient register, and we do normally recover any incorrect funding that practice has received for that person. So basically, when someone does enroll, really take special note of the enrolment form, in particular the eligibility and entitlement questions. So it's all very well, getting the patient to fill them out, but when they do fill it out and they do choose one of these eligibility options, do ask for evidence, and I'm sure you're doing that, but do ask for evidence to substantiate their eligibility. Once again, here's an example of one audit we did where a patient had actually circled no to each of the eligibility questions, but the practice still enrolled them for whatever reason. So you do need to really take note of how the patient's answering the question, and certainly look for evidence of eligibility from them. So what can you do when someone walks in the door and wants to enrol? Firstly, to make sure the practice is safe, seek evidence of eligibility. Make sure you cite it. And when you do get it, if possible, it's not mandatory, but we would suggest you take a copy of it and save it to file. Then check they're entitled. Make sure they are residing permanently in New Zealand. And another problem we have is when patients come into the practice, they may mention to the doctor, look, I need a checkup because I'm moving over to Canada for the next 2 years, or heading over to the UK. Educate your doctors to maybe ask the next question, or if the patient has said this to you, ask the next question, how long are you going away for? Because if they are going away for more than 6 months, then they are no longer entitled, and they will need to be removed from the register once they do leave the country. And when I say removed from the register, you need to end their enrolment. So, another thing for practices with those time-limited visas, make sure you do schedule a reminder to double-check that visa near the time of expiry, just to see that they do have a new visa that allows them to remain enrolled. And if you are advised by the Ministry of Health, and in fact not even just the Ministry of Health, if you find out from any source that someone is no longer eligible or that they have moved overseas, you must immediately end their enrolment. So here's hopefully you'll get a copy of the presentation. Here's just some websites you can go to that for an enrolment checklist, the eligibility direction, so you can see the different criteria, and also the enrolment requirements, which are effectively the rules for enrolment. I definitely recommend you read those. And as I mentioned before, if you do see something that you are suspicious of, there is a free health integrity line and a email that you can contact and voice your concerns. So that is it. That is eligibility and entitlement. So if there's time for any questions, feel free to ask any questions you want. Or if you want to go away and contact me, if the PHO give you my details, you can contact me at any time with any questions. Or if you have been provided evidence of eligibility and you're not sure what you're looking at or need someone else to have another look at it, feel free to send it through to me and I can have a wee check for you as well.